we are on.
We are on. Welcome, everybody, to another Coffee with Doc. I hope you filled up your mugs. I forgot to do mine, so I'm going to milk my last little bit of coffee here at the EMS Museum office. But we are delighted to have Doc back after his big adventure last time. And
And I
instead of
have my coffee.
excellent, way to go, you. We have Mike Williams, who was our guest host last time, now in the hot seat. So now he gets to be grilled, just like we do all our other guests. You guys
I have my coffee too.
There we go.
excellent. I am down to like half inch of coffee, but it'll be good. Lots of great stories and some exciting news at the end. So be sure to stay tuned the whole way through.
Sorry, guys. That was the other phone. So, Michael, good afternoon.
Good afternoon.
You and I have known each other for a few weeks, but why don't you give a little background on your involvement in EMS and maybe what led you into EMS from your career in the military?
Well, actually, Doc, it was the other way around. I started in EMS all the way back in 1971, so I am truly one of the dinosaurs out there. But a short, interesting story, since this is the History Museum, I'll give you a little history of what EMS was like in those days. I started out, I was 16 years old, and I was the doorman of a theater at the highest accident intersection in the city of Detroit. So being a doorman, I was outside all the time, and it meant these crashes would occur in front of me. And I'd stand there and watch and go, somebody should do something. And then these really cool guys in white smocks would show up, load up the patients, and disappear. And I said, that's what I want to do. So I found out what it took, and I went and got my advanced first aid card, which took 20 hours. And I went down to the ambulance service and said, I want to be an ambulance driver. And they laughed hysterically and said, no, you can't do this until you have this newfangled certification called CPR. Okay, so I got CPR and I went back and they said, kid, you don't get it. You're only 16 years old. You can't work here. So I went home crushed. And then I got a phone call and they said, we're really hard up for people. Would you work under a false ID? I said, sure, that's not a problem. So that started my career in EMS. And just to give you a flavor of what it was like in those days, it was with a private ambulance service, the largest one in the city of Detroit. And it was really interesting. All my partners were ex-cons because the Michigan penal system would allow early parole if they got an advanced first aid card and could go to work for an ambulance company. So those were the high quality employees we had. And as ambulance drivers, as the name implies, we threw the people in the back and hauled butt to the hospital. Patient care was minimal. However, they advertised we were oxygen equipped. And we did have an oxygen cylinder, but I don't remember it ever having oxygen. And we were radio controlled. And we had a CB radio. And if we were within 2 miles of the station, okay. Otherwise, we did system status posting, which meant that we went to the local gas station and we sat next to the payphone. And we would call dispatch and give them the number. And if they had a call, they would call the payphone and then we would be dispatched from there.
So was that Jack Stout's model for system status management?
This is before Jack even knew what that was. So anyways, I worked my way through college doing that. It was a great job because I got paid $2.50 an hour. That's $2.50 for 20 out of 24 hours because they guaranteed 4 hours of sleep, which I never got. But that's okay. They didn't pay for 4 hours. Anyways, after a number of years, I worked my way through college doing this. I was not getting into it anymore because we really weren't saving a lot of lives and we weren't doing a lot of good things for people. So I did the only sane thing in the world. I joined the military during the Vietnam era. And I wound up going in the Air Force, and I had actually graduated from the paramedic program before I went in the Air Force, and that was, I think my paramedic card in Michigan is number 5. And that was because there was 5 people in the class, and my last name started with a W. So anyways, I went into the Air Force, and they said, okay, with your background, you don't have to go to any technical schools. We're going to make you a medic. And I went, okay. And I showed up in my first duty assignment, and guys with no stripes got sent to the basement to count gloves. And the reality was they just didn't know what to do with me. So they wound up sticking me in the emergency room. And a military emergency department is a little different than a civilian world. This was before we had PAs or anything else. And every doctor was the medical officer of the day, which meant if you had an emergency physician, which were rare, they would take care of everything. On the other hand, you had a radiologist or an anesthesiologist or a plastic surgeon. They would basically come in and say, you do whatever needs to be done, and we'll sign the paperwork after it's over with. So we were diagnosing, treating the whole 9 yards. And that's one of the things about early military medicine. A medic basically did everything that a PA would do today, and some things that a PA isn't even capable of doing. For example, my specialty was suturing. And I learned from a plastic surgeon, and I was the guy that had to do all the suturing when a problem came in. Well, you're not going to see that in the civilian world. Anyways, from there, after 4 years of doing that, the Air Force said, hey, you've got a degree. What are you doing in an emergency room? We're going to give you a commission and make you a pilot. That makes perfectly good sense. So I flew airplanes for a while, and then I was teaching at the Air Force Academy, and I was getting a little restless because I really missed EMS. I worked for the local volunteer ambulance service. I worked for the fire department in my off-duty time. But I was at the academy, and I was teaching leadership, and I opened up the Air Force Times, and here was an advertisement that said, we're looking for a certified paramedic, which I was, with a proven track record of leadership, which is what I was teaching, to take over our ground, water, and air ambulance service in Tallahassee, Florida. And I showed it to my wife, and I said, what do you think? And she goes, where's Tallahassee? Of course, I didn't know, but I wanted to sell this program. And I said, oh, it's right next to Disney World. She went, okay. And for those of you that don't know the geography, it's about a 6-7 hour drive to get to Disney World from Tallahassee. So anyways, I took over the ambulance service for a hospital-based ambulance service that provided everything for the city of Tallahassee. And at the time, across the street was the state EMS office. And there was a man named Larry Jordan that worked there, and Larry was legendary in EMS. And he recruited me to come over there as his number 2. And so I came over to the state EMS office as the number 2 guy. And unfortunately, about a year later, Larry passed away. And I became the state EMS director, probably the youngest one in history because I was in my early 30s. And I got into the bureaucracy and spent 6 years as the EMS director for the state of Florida, which was really a fascinating, good job. We built a real good system, and we not only regulated ambulance services and fire departments, but we also had the responsibility of building the first statewide system of trauma centers. And the other thing was we went into the emergency departments and we regulated them. We didn't go to the rest of the hospital, but we regulated the emergency departments. So I learned a lot about all of those kind of things. From there was a guy named Paul Verrocchi that was starting a little company that he called American Medical Response. And I met him at a conference, and he said, why don't you come to work for me? And I said, what would I do? And he said, ambulance stuff. And I had had about enough of the bureaucracy and everybody sticking their hands in the cookie jar. So I went to work for this little known company called AMR. And I said to Paul, I said, okay, where am I going to go? And he said, Mississippi. And I went, do people live there? And he went, yes. And I went to Mississippi, and I became the chief administrative officer for the Southeast. And the reason we were in Mississippi is there's a gentleman named John Rester who started an ambulance service, which was one of the original 4 that AMR purchased. And by the way, just for the friends in Mississippi, I absolutely love the state. It's my favorite place I ever lived, and I don't disparage it at all. But after about a year of being the chief administrative officer, they reorganized the company, and I became the CEO of what was called the Gulf Coast Division, which included Mississippi and Louisiana, and I had EMS for the city of New Orleans at the time. Did that for a couple of years, and then reorganized again, and they said, what do you think of Las Vegas? And I said, they gamble? And they went, no, you're going to take over Las Vegas. And it was like, oh my gosh. So I became the EMS director for the city of Las Vegas, which eventually grew into the Southwest division of AMR. I had a 4-state region. And I did that for a long time. And as most people know, AMR went through some various generations, and every year they were purchased by somebody different. And we were finally purchased by a school bus company. And they really thought they knew everything about EMS because they knew what the best tires to buy were and what the best oil to buy was. And so I decided it's time to move along, and spent a little bit of time up in Idaho working a fire-based system where we consolidated a number of fire departments to create a single ambulance service. And then from there, was recruited to come to the city of Atlanta and take over the Grady EMS system. And for those who aren't familiar with Atlanta, Grady Hospital is one of the oldest hospitals in the United States. It goes back to the Civil War. And the ambulance service is the oldest continuously operated ambulance service in the United States. They started in 1892 and are in service to this day. The problem they were having at the time was Jack Stout, as you mentioned earlier, had brought in this concept of system status management, which we had used in AMR the entire time I was there. And the Fulton County, who provided the contract, said, we want a high performance system status organization. And the folks in Atlanta had been entrenched in the way they had been doing it since the 1800s and certainly had no idea what that meant. So I came in to rebuild that system, and we created one of the finest high performance systems in the country. We did over 100,000 transports a year, very busy, and just an outstanding group of people. From there, I had told my wife, she said, is this it? Is this going to end your career? And I said, well, I think so, but there's only 2 places that I would be interested in going. And that's either Pinellas County in Florida or the REMSA in Reno, Nevada. And the reason was they were the only triple accredited ambulance services in the country, which meant they were accredited by the Commission on Accreditation of Ambulance Service, the Commission on Accreditation of Air Medical Transport Services, and the Emergency Medical Dispatch System. And then I never thought another thing about it until I got a phone call from Patrick Smith, who was the president and CEO in Reno, Nevada. And he said, I need your help, which is Patrick's famous 4 words. And next thing I knew, I was the vice president of operations in Reno, Nevada. and wonderful experience, a great system, and
That was for
probably,
Remsen? That was for
pardon me,
Remsen, Mike?
REMSA, the Regional Emergency Medical Services Authority. That's a public utility model system, um, which I think probably my claim to fame was I wrote a grant that the Department of Health and Human Services was looking for innovative models that would improve healthcare in the country. And we came up with this little concept called community paramedics. And we put in a grant and said we would create community paramedics that could take care of patients that had acute problems after they were discharged from the hospital, or chronic conditions, excuse me. And we would treat them in their home with no intentions of transporting. But we had another segment of it that said, if we do transport, we will transport to the most appropriate facility, which not only meant emergency departments, but it meant urgent care centers, doctors' offices, those sorts of things. And the other piece of it was we would put RNs in the dispatch center who would triage these calls. And they would have a nurse advice if it wasn't needing an ambulance. They would triage those out and provide advice over the phone. If they needed a community paramedic to spend some time in the home and not transport, they would send that. And of course, if it was an emergency, they'd send an ambulance. Anyways, we won this $10.5 million grant from the federal government. And the Fed said they would actually pay for us to do these sorts of things. And I'm very, very proud that now the community paramedic program goes by many other names, but it is being used across the country now. And I'm very, very proud of that. Anyways, I spent a lot of time there, moved over to a sister company called SEMSA, Sierra Medical Services Alliance, and operated a series of ambulance services throughout California. And that was a great experience, and have kind of stepped aside and moved back to Florida to be close to the kids. So that's kind of my career in a nutshell. It's been a wild and crazy ride. I think I have worked in just about every type of system that there is. And I won't say one system is better than another. I will say that there's a solution for every community that works best for them. I don't buy into private ambulance services better than fire or anything else. They're all great. And so, you know, I encourage everybody, whatever their model is, to just make it the best they possibly can. Since I've been with the museum, I've kind of become the resident expert on military medicine. Besides the fact that I did serve, my last 10 years in the military was in the reserves, but I was with the headquarters for special operations, which was a joint command, which meant we had Army Special Forces, Navy SEALs, and Air Force commandos all in the same unit. And I came in just in time for a little exercise called Desert Shield and Desert Storm, and then Operation Provide Hope in Somalia, which some of you may have heard as Black Hawk Down. And although I wasn't a medic, I was in a command position, and I worked with what's called the shooters and door kickers. I was still the resident medic because we had no medics assigned to the headquarters. So every time somebody got an owie, I was the guy that would take care of it. But anyways, I've kind of made a study of the history of military medicine. I'm very proud that I've been asked to curate a presentation with the museum that'll appear in the first part of next year at the Aurora Fire Museum in Aurora, Illinois. And in that presentation, I kind of traced the history of military medicine, which quite frankly traces itself all the way back to the Roman armies. They had their own system of medicine. It wasn't very effective, didn't do a whole lot, but they kind of pioneered a little thing that today we call a tourniquet. All they knew is that it would stop bleeding, but 90% of the time the patient would die from gangrene because once they stopped the bleeding, they didn't know what to do with it. Trace that along to the Napoleonic Wars, and Napoleon probably brought EMS to the military. And it was a doctor by the name of Leary, who was a military surgeon. And he would sit there and watch the military caissons, which were the guys carrying ammunition to the front, had these really cool wagons and horses that would go across. And he said, well, why can't we put a patient on there? And he created the first system of ambulances. He created the first system of triage, determining who got treated first, who got an amputation or who didn't. And he became so famous that when Napoleon finally lost at the Battle of Waterloo, very few people know that the British were a little ruthless and they really didn't care for the French. So they were executing all of the French officers that they captured. And when Leary was taken to the wall to be executed, one of the NCOs recognized him as this famous doctor that saved military lives. And he didn't have prejudice towards whether they were English or French or anything else. And he was spared from being executed because he had done such great things for all the victims of the war. Move up to the Civil War, and the real advances were made in the American Civil War. They finally came up with wagons that actually had springs, so it had a suspension system that didn't jostle the patients. They had the forerunner of the medic, which was actually called the litter bearer, and they organized ambulance systems within the military that were military people that were dedicated to that role. They also perfected the system of triage and who got treated first by the doctors. They created echelons of service. In other words, who was at a first aid station close to the battle, and then they would put a surgical center further away. So they made some real advances. Zip up to World War I, which most people don't realize was probably one of the most brutal wars Americans have ever been involved in. And besides getting shot, people there suffered from mustard gas injuries. The largest injury was trench foot, from being in trenches. That's where the name came from. Dysentery, from living in these cold, muddy ditches for all their time. And so they created a system to move patients out of the trenches, where litter bearers, who were dedicated litter bearers, would go up to the edge of the trenches, load the patient, physically haul them back to a first aid station, which were staffed with guys that could put tourniquets on, put bandages on, that sort of thing. Then they were put in the very first motorized ambulances and taken to the rear. Interestingly enough, the ambulances originally were not owned by the Army. They were volunteer corps, and the Salvation Army, that's where they got their start. And two of the most famous ambulance drivers of World War I was a guy named Walt Disney, and another one was Ernest Hemingway. And so we became motorized in World War I. Zip up to World War II, and this was the advent of the real medic that was allowed to treat people at the point of injury. The theory was they had a red cross on their helmet, so under the Geneva Convention, nobody could shoot at them. And that lasted a couple months, and they quit putting red crosses because they became a real target of the enemy. But the big advances was where they could treat at the point of injury. They had a thing called sulfa that they could put on wounds to kind of disinfect it at the point of injury. And the other thing that they had was morphine. And they relieve pain and suffering. They treat the patient, keep them as alive as they could, and move on to the next one. And then later, after the battles, subsided, then they would come and take them away. The other thing that came out of World War II were hospital ships and hospital trains. They would move the patients through a triage system, and they would wind up on the trains, which would take them to a ship, and the ship would bring them home to the States. The interesting part was the ships and the trains were staffed with physicians and nurses and medics that would take care of the patient during transport. So we became a little more sophisticated. Then along came Vietnam, the advent of the helicopter. Actually, before that was the Korean War, where the helicopter was first used, and the concept of the MASH hospital happened. Mobile Army Surgical Hospitals. It is more than a TV show and a great movie. And they had surgeons that were real close to the battle, so they could operate right away. And if the battle lines moved, the MASH unit moved. They were very mobile, and they would be close to the battle, but not right on top of it. And they would move as the battle would change. In Vietnam, helicopters became a lot more sophisticated, and physicians started trusting medics a lot more. So they were allowed to use drugs, IVs, again, at the point of injury. But medical evacuation was very rapid because of the helicopters. And triage was a system of hospitals throughout Vietnam, much like we use today. Cardiac patients go to one, trauma patients go to another, so on and so forth. And the biggest thing was the use of the radio and the fact that the medic could call in the helicopter. And when on board the helicopter, they could call the hospital to make sure they were going to the right hospital, and the hospital knew what was coming. So a lot of evolution happened in Vietnam, but to me, probably the biggest was the infamous white paper that was published in, I believe it was 1967, that pointed out that more people died on the highways of the United States than soldiers in Vietnam. And part of the reason part of the reason that pain and suffering wasn't going on was because of the medic and the rapid transportation. And that was the birth of the modern day EMS system in the civilian world of the United States. And that came out of the military also. We had Johnny and Roy, and we had paramedics like myself. And the fact of the matter is the Army had been doing that for a decade before any civilians ever came along. During my era of things like Desert Shield and Desert Storm, I can't say that we did anything better than the guys in Vietnam did, but we had even more rapid transportation, bigger, more powerful helicopters. We could take multiple patients on the helicopters. We had major airlift aircraft that were flying hospitals. And literally, you could be wounded in the middle of Iraq, and within 4 to 6 hours, you could be in Landstuhl, Germany, which is the biggest military hospital in the world, or you could be transported to Walter Reed or Bethesda in the United States. And it did happen that fast. And the transports across the ocean had physicians and nurses. Now, many people don't understand and realize My son is a special operations pilot on C-130s, and he takes the modern day mobile Army surgical team, which actually sets up an operating room in the back of the aircraft. And literally, you pick up the patient just yards from the point of injury, and they perform surgery in the air while they're transporting them to definitive care. And they do that on a regular and frequent basis. So, I think you draw a lot of parallels to what military medicine did and how that translated to our modern day EMS system. And I can tell you from my education in the military, it translated into building these EMS systems I've had the privilege of being involved in. I never lost that military training. So that's it kind of in a nutshell, Doc, unless you've got any questions.
Well, a couple of observations, Mike. You and I first met when I was serving on the Committee on Trauma with Ray Alexander.
Yep.
And I'll tell you a funny anecdote I don't think you know about, but you were working for Larry at the time. I had some guys from the Joint Task Group come in to where I was running the training center in South Florida. And they said, we want to learn this, this, and this. And I looked at them and I realized they were packing, number one. So these guys were serious players. So I picked up the phone and I called Larry. And I said, hey, Larry, they want to learn this and they want to learn that and they want to learn the other thing. I said, am I okay to do this with them? He said, do they want a certificate? I said, hell no, they don't want a certificate. They're going out to Belize and other bad places. They want to know how to stay alive in the jungle. He said, teach them anything you want. So that was one of my interesting involvements with Larry. The other place you mentioned, Pinellas County. I think probably the best grant writer in the state of Florida for a long time was Chuck Kearns down in Pinellas County.
Yep.
And I used to spend a lot of time talking to him. Okay, how do we write this thing? How do we do it? How do we phrase it? What's the introduction got to look like, and so on. We have been blessed in the state of Florida with some really, really talented people. Other observation I'd make is, and you and I are familiar with these guys because we've rubbed shoulders with a lot of them. The specialty in the Army was the Special Forces Medical Sergeant. That was the first Spec Ops medic that sort of evolved. And they were taught down at BAMC. And then all of a sudden, Congress said, this is a good idea. And the guy that you're going to get to know really well, Cliff Cloonan, ended up at the first dean at Joint Special Operations Medical Training Center at Fort Bragg. And I had a lot of opportunity to get to know the guys up there and what they were teaching because I had to run some stuff in there now and then. But it's very surprising just how interesting and how advanced the military medic has become. And I think my greatest frustration over the last 30 some odd years has been to go to the State EMS Medical Directors meeting, which is now not the State EMS Medical Directors Association, it's something else now, and say, look, when these guys come into your state, do you have any idea the level of training they've got? And everybody would nod, yeah, we know. And I said, why don't you just grant them a license instead of handing them a list of training centers? So I think that battle still goes on today.
It does, Doc. And I'll tell you, we worked real hard at my time in the state EMS office to do just exactly that. And ironically, EMS leadership at that time were dead set against it and said, no way in heck. When I was in Nevada, I was appointed by a special commission that the governor appointed to do just that, to issue licenses to military medics after they left the service. And the governor endorsed it, and everybody said, hooray, let's do it. And nothing has happened. So it's the wheels of bureaucracy that move really slow.
Well, it's the bureaucracy, and then the headwinds we've always run into with that is the training centers feel like they're being deprived of a student that they might be able to get tuition from.
Very true.
So it's been tough, but military has contributed tremendously to the growth of EMS in this country. And we've learned a hell of a lot from the experiences of guys on the battlefield and what they have encountered. And we've gotten some great products. And in your time and mine, well, I'll tell you about in my time. I had a great uncle that was actually gassed in World War One, and interesting to sit and talk to him and listen to what he said about World War One and what the carnage was like in World War One. It was not horrible. It was horrible. But a lot of the guys you and I have known, some of the best trauma surgeons that I've known in my lifetime, came out of the military.
That's right.
So, and they got a lot of practice, unfortunately.
Yeah.
But, they were damn good. So anyway, it's great. I'm looking forward to this presentation at Aurora. And I think it should attract a lot of people and give them a little better insight into the crossover between military and civilian EMS. And I'm hoping that as you, since you're vice president of the museum, we hope we'll get a lot of new members from this kind of exposure too, because that's really something that we are all about, is getting more people to become members of the organization. I guess I'd be remiss also in not mentioning, putting a plug in. On November 15th, we're doing another Paws and Claws opportunity where you and your pet can take a first aid course on taking care of your pet. And the museum makes a little money from each person that registers for that course. And I've talked to some of the people that were on the first one, including Christy here at the bottom of the screen, who I think she had her wild and crazy dog with her and did the Paws and Claws course. And I'm going to see if I can find space in my calendar to take the course myself, because I have two wild and crazy young Pembroke Welsh Corgi puppies here in the house. So, and I'm sure one of them is going to kill the other one of these days. It's inevitable. But Christy, do you want to add anything or ask Mike anything further?
Well, I couldn't take notes fast enough. So next time around, I'm going to be asking Mike lots of questions. But yes, the Battlefield Medicine to Civilian EMS exhibit is currently being installed at the Aurora Regional Fire Museum. And for those of you that have been long-term members or fans of the EMS Museum, you know that's where we launched our first exhibit in April 2019. So it's been a great partnership that we've had. So thank you to them. And I think, Mike, did we decide in February we're going to do a live stream presentation? So you'll get the full gist of all the medical military history background with pictures next time. And members, of course, get invites to all of our special events. And if you like to party, we have a membership party coming up November 14th. So that's going to be a busy weekend for us here at the museum. Make sure you renew or join as a member. It's never too late to join. It's never too early to join. So the more members we have, the more programs we can do. And I've been having lots of fun with these coffee sessions. Now that we've been into it for 2 months, I'm enjoying my Friday afternoons. Just have to say that.
For those of you that are new to the National EMS Museum and haven't seen one of these Coffee with Doc sessions before, the lady at the bottom of my screen, I imagine she's at the bottom of your screen as well, is Christy Van Hoven, who's our director. We actually have a paid full-time type director that's going to keep moving the direction and the museum in the direction we want it to go. And she has been a dynamite addition to the growth of the National EMS Museum, and we are thrilled to have her with us, and we plan on keeping her here for a long time.
Excellent. Yes, I'm going to be sticking around for a while. Maybe one day I'll be cool enough to sit in the seat too, but I'm not a dino yet. I have to take more turns on the back of the ambulance. All right, wonderful. Well, thank you all so much for tuning in. We love spending our Fridays with you. Be sure to tune in tomorrow afternoon. We have another coffee with Doc session with one of our friends of the museum, Clark, who will be talking about the development of ALS on the East Coast. And little known fact, it's been around for over 100 years. So we're going to kind of hear about the tracing of that story and the development of an actual ALS system over 100 years ago. So tune in tomorrow afternoon. I was bad and I didn't pull up the time, but I think it's 3:30 Eastern. Check our Facebook post. Make sure you get the time right. If not, these are always archived on Facebook, so you can check back anytime. And if you want to be a guest, shoot us a message. Let's get you in the hot seat too. Thank
It
you
is
all very
at 1600 Eastern time. You're absolutely right. That's
All
when it
right,
is.
good. 16:30 Eastern time. That's 3:30 for you guys Central, 2:30 as we move across, and 1:30. So bring a late lunch if you're in the Pacific time zone.
Right.
We will catch you all tomorrow. Thank you so much.
Thank you
Have
all.
a
Thanks, Mike.
You bet.
wonderful
Thank you.
Yep.
evening.
See y'all.
Wait, hold on. We have to get, oh, damn it. We have to get used to staying on because otherwise it'll cut off.
I'm showing that you're still recording.
I know I'm recording, but that's fine.